I want to introduce tonight's speaker, Mike Weber. Mike is a popular returning speaker for the museum, and he has a long history and love of Cornwall. As a child, he collected rock and mineral specimens from in and around the waste rock piles, and that led him to the study of geology. As a 1982 geoscience graduate from Penn State, Mike worked for 36 years as a geologist, health physicist, and manager for the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the U.S. Geological Survey. After retiring from federal service, he returned to Cornwall Furnace, where he serves as a guide and researches the history of mining and geology at Cornwall and similar deposits in Pennsylvania. And Mike is a weekly volunteer at the museum and gives guided tours almost every Friday at the museum. So if you like what you see and want a guided tour from Mike, come visit us on most Fridays. So I'd like to welcome our speaker tonight, Mr. Mike Weber.
Well, thanks, Mike, and good evening to everyone. As we approach Veterans Day on Friday of this week, it is fitting that we salute our veterans for their service to our nation tonight. In our program, we'll also recognize the role that Cornwall played in helping to defend our nation. I'd like to thank the Friends of the Cornwall Iron Furnace for supporting this webinar, and especially Mike Emery, Cornwall Site Administrator, and Kathy Donaldson, Treasurer of the Associates. Of course, on Veterans Day, we honor the men and women who have served in the U.S. military and defended our nation. The theme for Veterans Day this year is honor. As Americans, we recognize that there is a distinct honor in serving to protect our way of life and the Constitution of the United States of America. And while we honor our veterans this evening, we also honor the men and women of the Cornwall community who have helped to defend our nation by serving in the military and in other ways that we'll discuss tonight during the last 285 years. Now, in my presentation, I will briefly review the history of U.S. military conflicts and the contributions to our country's defense by the furnaces, mines, farms, and people of Cornwall. And I'll concentrate on several specific conflicts where the contributions of Cornwall are well established, including the 7 Years' War, Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World Wars I and II, and the Korean War. And I plan to leave plenty of time at the end of my presentation for your questions and comments. I should share in advance that I will mention the names of specific veterans tonight. And these are veterans that I came across in conducting research about Cornwall and about the role that it has played in helping to defend our country. I may not include all because I may not know everyone who helped to contribute in this cause. So if I leave someone out, particularly someone from your family, I apologize in advance. It's by no means that I have selected them not to be included, but I only could use the records that were available to me. So please be with us. Now, since the mines, Cornwall Iron Furnace, and the community of Cornwall were established in the late 1730s, Cornwall has contributed to the nation's defense during numerous conflicts. Cornwall Furnace began producing cast iron in 1742 and continued until the furnace went out of blast in 1883. The hot blast furnaces of Cornwall, different than Cornwall Furnace, these include Anthracite, Bird Coleman, and North Cornwall, also produced cast iron from the mid-1800s until the early 1900s. The Cornwall mines produced iron ore from 1737 until they closed in 1973. The bar at the bottom of this slide shows several of the more significant conflicts that involved the U.S. military during the same period. The United States has relied on its military during many conflicts, far too many to discuss each one this evening. Consequently, I omitted some of the more major conflicts, as well as some of the less well-known conflicts. For example, the Coal Wars in the 1800s and 1900s, the expedition to Korea in 1871, the Homestead Steel Strike in 1892, and the Cripple Creek Miners' Strike of 1894. So let's review now several of these larger conflicts and discuss Cornwall's contributions during each of them. We used to think that Cornwall's first contributions to our nation's defense occurred during the Revolutionary War. However, recent reviews of ledger books by Cornwall's summer intern, Victoria Abramczyk, confirmed that the furnace manufactured cannonballs that were used during the 7 Years' War, which is commonly known as the French and Indian War. This war was a global conflict for preeminence between Great Britain and France. The conflict involving the American colonies began on May 17, 1756, and ended on February 15, 1763. And by the end of the war, France ceded most of its possessions in North America, and Spain ceded Florida to Great Britain. So, how did Cornwall contribute? During this conflict, Cornwall Furnace was operating under a 20-year lease. According to the Cornwall Furnace account books, Nathaniel Giles purchased mold patterns to cast cannonballs at the end of August 1758. During the next 3 weeks, the furnace at Cornwall cast 470 large cannonballs, 228 medium balls, and 138 small cannonballs, as well as 60 double-headed shot. Although the account books show that Balzer Rhodes was paid to deliver 2 tons of shot to Philadelphia by October 1758, we do not know who was the ultimate recipient of the shot. But we suspect that the cannonballs were used by privateers and may have been distributed by the merchants such as Samuel and Robert Purviance. At the time of the conflict, Cornwall was in the outer perimeter of the land settled by the colonists in the Pennsylvania province. Hostile raids occurred in this area, particularly in the Lebanon Valley, and folks in the Lebanon Valley were vulnerable to attacks by these raiding parties. For example, on June 26, 1756, Friedrich Weiser, the nephew of Conrad Weiser, was killed in a raid near Swatara Gap, as seen in the gravestone pictured on this slide. Residents of Cornwall undoubtedly experienced some sleepless nights, fear, and sorrow during the 7 Years' War. One of the best documented and shared descriptions of Cornwall's contributions occurred during the Revolutionary War from 1775 until 1783. In tours of the Cornwall Iron Furnace, we specifically focus on these contributions. Cornwall Furnace manufactured cast iron cannon and a large amount of cast iron shot and shells in support of the Continental Navy. The furnace also produced cast iron stoves as well as salt pans for use by the Continental Army. In addition, the iron masters at Cornwall during the Revolutionary War, Curtis and Peter Grubb Jr., served as colonels in the Pennsylvania militia, and other men from the iron plantation at Cornwall also served in the Army. The farms of Cornwall produced wheat and other grains that were used to feed Continental soldiers, including the wounded and sick who were stationed at hospitals in Lancaster and Berks counties. The Grubbs also pastured colonial army horses on the plantation grounds, and they housed, fed, and paid Hessian prisoners of war for their labors that supported the plantation, including operation of the furnace. Let's examine these contributions in greater detail. At the outbreak of the war with Great Britain in 1775, the American colonies lacked the capability to produce artillery for the Army and cannon for Navy ships and coastal fortifications. The Continental Congress and the Pennsylvania colony gave a high priority to production of cannon from the iron furnaces, including Cornwall. The Congress urgently contracted with iron masters at Cornwall, Hopewell, Warwick, and Reading furnaces to produce cannon. Captain Daniel Joy taught the founders at these furnaces how to cast, bore, and test the cannon. Cornwall cast 42 12-pounder cannons that weighed about 3,000 pounds each. Although Cornwall cast its first cannon on July 6, 1776, that gun did not pass its proof test. The first cannon that was successfully cast bored, and proved at Cornwall was in August 1776 and was delivered to the Continental Congress at Independence Hall in Philadelphia on October 26th of that same year. By June 1777, Cornwall successfully delivered 41 cannon to Philadelphia. These guns were installed on Continental frigates that were used or fitted in and around Philadelphia. The 42nd cannon did not successfully cast and today is on display at the exhibit at Cornwall Furnace. In comparison, Reading Furnace cast 60 cannon, Warwick Furnace cast 92, and Hopewell Furnace cast at least 96 cannon. 4 of the cannon cast at Warwick Furnace were found buried on site earlier just this year in June. Hopewell likely provided additional cannon shot and shell through early 1778, when France allied with the American colonies and began supplying arms. In March 1780, Cornwall cast and sold 4 4-pound cannon, which were considerably smaller and lighter than the cannon that were manufactured for the Continental Navy. The cannon were valuable, but ammunition and gunpowder were required to make them weapons of war. The cannon fired solid shot or cannonballs, as well as hollow shells that contained black gunpowder and detonated using a lit fuse. As seen in the graph on this slide, from the bottom to the top, Cornwall produced 722 10-inch shells and 162 8-inch shells. Cornwall also delivered 2,724-pound cannonballs, 2,762 18-pound cannonballs, and 6,566 12-pound cannonballs during the Revolutionary War. The total weight of iron in the shot and shells exceeded 127 tons of cast iron. The 12-pound cannonballs on display today at Cornwall were used in proofing the guns. So that indicates that the total number of cannonballs manufactured at Cornwall exceeded the totals that were actually delivered to the military. Besides the immediate shortage of cannon and munitions at the outbreak of hostilities with Great Britain in 1775, the American colonies also experienced an immediate and serious shortage of salt. Almost all of the salt consumed by the colonies had been imported from England. The salt shortage immediately impacted civilians and the military, as salt was needed by the Continental Army for food for soldiers, for horses, and for medical supplies. And to make the situation more dire, British soldiers attacked and destroyed salt works and their salt stores in the mid-Atlantic colonies. The technology for producing salt had changed little over the centuries between Agricola's publication in the mid-1500s and the late 1700s. The colonists had unsuccessfully attempted to produce their own salt by boiling seawater. That required large amounts of firewood and produced only limited quantities of salt. For example, boiling 400 gallons of seawater produced about 1 bushel or 50 pounds of salt. The Continental Congress passed several measures to remedy the salt shortage. On December 29, 1775, the Congress encouraged the colonies to stimulate salt production by offering incentives. Congress reprinted in pamphlet format a large essay by Brownrigg on making salt from 1748. You see that pamphlet on the right-hand side of your screen. On May 28, 1776, still desperate for salt, Congress authorized a bounty of $1/3 per bushel of salt produced. And in June 1777, Congress even established a congressional committee to devise ways and means of supplying salt for the United States. These incentives paved the way for the startup of many private salt works along the eastern seaboard by 1777. In some of these works, saltwater brines were created first by evaporating seawater in large ponds, and then those brines were converted into salt crystals by evaporating them in shallow cast iron pans called salt pans. You can see those pans in the illustration on the bottom of the slide. The salt pans were heavy, made out of cast iron, weighing between 400 pounds and 1,600 pounds, and they required large molds for casting. Between November 1st, 1777, and February 6th, 1778, Cornwall cast several tons of these pans for military use and likely sold them to civilians as well to facilitate production of salt. And as far as we know, none of these salt pans cast at Cornwall have been found. In addition to the cannon, shot, and salt pans, the Continental Congress also ordered 1 ton of small 10-plate stoves from Cornwall on December 13th, 1777. This was a much smaller purchase than the other cast iron items. The stoves were intended to help warm the troops as they wintered in Valley Forge during the end of 1777 and the beginning of 1778. In March 1778, Cornwall Furnace charged the Continental Congress 125 pounds for the 5 of the 10-plate stoves. Although Cornwall Furnace was quick to provide the requested support, Congress took considerably longer to pay its bills. By February 1782, for example, Congress still owed the Grubbs more than 3,200 pounds for the 127 tons of shot and shell that Cornwall had cast and the Army and the Navy had consumed from Cornwall Furnace. Cornwall produced its share of men to support the Continental Army and the Pennsylvania militia. At the time of the Revolutionary War, the iron masters at Cornwall Furnace were Curtis and Peter Grubb Jr. Curtis was elected the colonel of the 2nd Battalion of the Lancaster County Associators, and Peter was elected to the same rank for the 8th Battalion. By May 1777, the Pennsylvania Board of War appointed Curtis as one of the commissioners for Lancaster County to procure blankets for the Continental Army. Men of the Cornwall community also were summoned for military service. The Grubbs petitioned to exempt their furnace workers from the draft so they could sustain production of arms, munitions, and other cast iron supplies to support the military. On July 31st, 1776, the Council of Safety ordered all workers at ironworks who were casting cannon or shot to remain at the furnaces and not to march with the militia. Pennsylvania also exempted the workers at Cornwall Furnace while they were casting the salt pans for the military. A large number of Hessian or German soldiers were captured at the Battle of Trenton on December 26, 1776, after General Washington and the Continental Army famously crossed the Delaware River. Most of the 1,500 Hessian soldiers who fought at Trenton were captured. By April 1777, the Hessian Prisoners of War had been marched to areas around Lancaster and Reading, Pennsylvania, including Lebanon and Cornwall. Relocation of the Hessian prisoners to this area was useful because it removed them from the field of battle and allowed them to mingle with a large population of colonists who spoke German. Although many Hessian soldiers died during the war, others chose to stay in the colonies after the war. Hessian prisoners of war were sent to work at the furnaces, including Cornwall, Elizabeth, Marianne, and Durham Furnace. The Grubbs paid the Hessian prisoners for their labors and gave them shelter and food, clothed them, and treated them to treats like tobacco and brandy. The Grubbs also paid the government in iron for the use of the Hessian soldiers. In addition to the Hessian soldiers captured near Trenton in 1776, another large group of German soldiers were captured in October 1777 at Saratoga, New York, and were held captive in Massachusetts until the end of the war. Although it's not considered a major conflict, I wanted to briefly mention the Whiskey Rebellion, which occurred in 1794, because of Robert Coleman's leadership role during the conflict. Now, as we know, Robert was an ironmaster at Cornwall Furnace. During the Revolutionary War, Robert Coleman served as a second lieutenant of the 2nd Company of Colonel Cunningham's 1st Battalion. He served briefly in and around New York at the beginning of the war before he came to Elizabeth Furnace, where he served as ironmaster during the rest of the war. Following the Revolutionary War, the newly formed federal government imposed a tax on distilled beverages, including whiskey and rum, in 1791. The impact of the tax was disproportionately felt by grain farmers, particularly those west of the Appalachian Mountains, who used their excess grains to produce whiskey in small stills. Resistance to the tax climaxed with a rebellion in July 1794 when a U.S. Marshal arrived in western Pennsylvania to serve writs on the distillers who had not paid the tax. Although President Washington was committed to using peaceful means to resolve the conflict, he requested governors to send militia to use force, if necessary, to quash the rebellion. The governors of Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, and New Jersey provided 13,000 militiamen who were commanded by President Washington himself, the commander-in-chief under the Constitution. The rebels disbanded before the military arrived in October 1794. After several tens of rebels were arrested, charged with treason, and then marched back to Philadelphia for their trials, Major General Daniel Morgan commanded a remnant force of 1,200 militiamen in western Pennsylvania to keep the peace after the rebellion subsided. And Robert Coleman served as captain of the Lancaster Troop of Light Horse, including 35 cavalrymen who served under General Morgan in 1795. By that time, Coleman had already acquired an initial stake in the Cornwall Furnace and mine, and within 3 years, he would acquire the remaining shares of the mine and the furnace. The federal government's response to the Whiskey Rebellion was viewed by many Americans as a successful use of force and of federal sovereignty under the Constitution. Collection of the tax on distilled spirits, however, remained a challenge and was later repealed by the Congress in 1801. And the rebellion also contributed to the formation of political parties in the United States. Apt that we should mention that on this election day. Conflicts continued during the next 70 years. Cornwall's next major contribution to the defense of the nation occurred during the Civil War from 1861 until 1865. Cornwall Iron Furnace and Cornwall Anthracite Furnaces, along with the mines, helped to provide the iron to support the industrial might of the Union throughout the conflict. One of the best documented contributions from Cornwall Furnace was the use of pig iron to produce cannon for the Union Navy. Now, by the Civil War, the techniques for manufacturing arms had changed from what they were during the Revolutionary War. Rather than cast the cannon directly at the furnace, Cornwall pig iron was melted down at the foundry of the Bush Hill Iron Works in Philadelphia to produce large gun blocks. The Navy then turned those gun blocks on a large lathe at the Washington Navy Yard to produce the Dahlgren guns or boat howitzers. Cornwall Furnace received a letter dated August 19, 1861, from the Department of the Navy requesting cold blast charcoal iron to produce 50-pounder rifled guns. By September 10th, less than a month later, Cornwall had shipped 32 tons of pig iron to the Bush Hill Iron Works. Captain Dahlgren, the inventor of the guns and for whom the guns were named, preferred Cornwall iron because of its strength and its density. Although a dispute ensued between Cornwall Furnace and the Navy regarding the schedule for the shipments and the weight and price of the iron, it was eventually resolved by January 1863, when the Navy paid $7,084.23 for the 21 gun blocks provided by Cornwall and Bush Hill. The Cornwall community also provided its share of soldiers and officers during the Civil War. The 37-year-old George Dawson Coleman, who was the grandson of Robert Coleman, and his wife Deborah, raised a company of volunteers in the 93rd Pennsylvania Volunteer Regiment between September 21st and October 28th, 1861. The Colemans paid for their uniforms, equipment, and flags. The regiment served as part of the 6th Army Corps in the Army of the Potomac. Camp Coleman Memorial Marker can be viewed today near the intersection of 8th and Lehman Streets in Lebanon. In the first draft of 1862, 3 men were drafted from Cornwall Township and 30 men from South Lebanon Township. By July 1862, about 700 men from Lebanon County were serving in the Union military. 3 men were granted conscientious objector status. George Dawson Coleman, who I just previously mentioned and was grandson of Robert Coleman, arranged for John Kreutzler to substitute for him in response to the draft in North Lebanon Township. During the second draft of February 1st, 1864, several notable people were drafted in the first class of 178 men, including Robert W. Coleman, who also was an ironmaster and grandson of Robert Coleman, and James Jackson and George Shea, who were founders in furnaces. The second draft class included J. Taylor Boyd, who had been recently appointed as the general superintendent of the mines of the Cornwall Ore Bank Company, John Shirk and Bird Shea, who were founders, and Artemus Wilhelm, manager of the Cornwall Iron Company. Before the end of the war, Sergeant Charles Marquette became the first resident of Lebanon County to earn the Medal of Honor, the federal government's highest and most prestigious military decoration. Marquette was awarded the medal for his service at the Battle of Petersburg on April 2nd, 1865, for his bravery in planting a flag on the Confederate breastworks after he had been wounded in the battle. Even the residents of the Cornwall area who were not serving in the military and who did not have loved ones serving in the war came close to experiencing the horrors of war. During late June and early July 1863, the Confederate Army, led by Robert E. Lee, invaded southern Pennsylvania. The invasion was stopped at the high water mark of the Confederacy, the Battle of Gettysburg, on July 1st through the 3rd, 1863. Among the early casualties during the battle was General John F. Reynolds. John F. Reynolds was the son of John Reynolds, who had served as the guardian for Thomas B. Coleman's children. Thomas was the son of Robert Coleman. And John had also served as the manager of the Cornwall Furnace until 1847. The invasion stirred fear and concern amongst the residents of the Cornwall community and in other parts of Pennsylvania. For example, horses owned by the Coleman family in York County were sent to the Cornwall area for safekeeping so they would not fall into the hands of the invaders. The Pennsylvania Railroad temporarily suspended service on July 1st and resumed service by July 9th as other businesses reopened. During the battle at Gettysburg, rumors flashed through the community regarding the rebel advance, with fears that other towns such as York, Harrisburg, and Lancaster would soon be overrun. The community breathed a collective sigh of relief when the Confederate Army retreated back to Virginia, and the townspeople in Cornwall helped by donating fabric for bandages, as well as blankets, food, and other goods to support the Union Army. Besides the carnage, deaths, injuries, and disruptions caused by the Civil War, the conflict also resulted in steep increases in the cost of essential items, including food, animal feed, and cast iron. As you see in this graph, the cost of pig iron produced at Cornwall nearly doubled during the war by November of 1863. The price later subsided to pre-war levels in the aftermath of the war. Similar price spikes were observed during the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. Positive impacts of the war included the end of slavery in the United States, consolidating the power of the federal government, building the industrial manufacturing might of the North, expanding railroads and other infrastructure, and laying the foundation for the emergence of the United States as a world power in the 20th century. By the beginning of the Great War, otherwise known as World War I, Cornwall Furnace and anthracite furnaces had shut down. Only North Cornwall Furnace and Bird Coleman furnaces continued to operate in Cornwall, and not for much longer. The mines, of course, continued to produce at moderately high levels, and iron mined and produced at Cornwall was used to construct warships, weapons, and other materiel used in the war, particularly before the United States entered the war. The United States was slow to mobilize its industrial might to arm and support the U.S. Army and Navy. The impact of the war on Cornwall was significant. because Bethlehem Steel used its wartime profits from weapons and ship manufacturing to acquire a controlling interest in the operation of the mines. Bethlehem Steel also soon ended the operation of the Bird Coleman furnaces and North Cornwall Furnace. In addition, Bethlehem Steel began planning to substantially boost the production of iron ore from the mines, including enhancing operations in the open pit, planning construction of the number 3 underground mine beneath the floor of the pit, and exploring for additional ore deposits that led to the discovery of the eastern ore body later mined by the number 4 mine at Cornwall. Military drafts also occurred during World War I once the United States entered the war in April 1917. The Selective Service Act was enacted on May 18, 1917, and required 24 million men between the ages of 21 and 45 to register for the draft. 2.8 million men were drafted and 2 million volunteered for service. In Lebanon, 3 military outfits were staffed in the 28th Division of the Army: Company D of the 109th Machine Gun Battalion, Company B of the 103rd Ammunition Train, and the headquarters unit of the 103rd Medical Regiment. General Pershing appropriately called the 28th the Iron Division. In addition, volunteers in the militia comprised Company H of the 4th Infantry Division. Peter, Clayton, and Sam Boyer served along with Frank Beard, Russell Staley, John Reppert, and Roy Horst from the Cornwall and Quentin area. Peter and Clayton served in the headquarters company of the 304th Engineers. Toward the beginning of the U.S. war efforts, in April 1917, Lebanon hosted the Patriot Parade, which was up to 4 miles long and required 3 hours to pass through downtown Lebanon. 50 men from Bethlehem Steel and the Cornwall Ore Bank Company carried the largest American flag in the parade, and you can see them in this photo on the right-hand side of your slide. When Peter Boyer III returned home after the war in June 1919, he stated, quote, "Home looked good, but nothing compared to the happy smile on Mother's face and the glad welcome from Brother John," end quote. As in all wars, some of the veterans who served from Lebanon and Cornwall did not return home after the war. 51 men from Lebanon County died during their service in World War I. And the nearby town of Bismarck was renamed Quentin in honor of Quentin Roosevelt, who died during the war and was the youngest son of President Theodore Roosevelt and his wife, Edith. After aggressive attacks by the Axis powers, the United States entered World War II in 1941. By this time, all of the furnaces in Cornwall had been closed down, and all but Cornwall Furnace had been demolished. Only the mines continued to produce iron, copper, and other metals. Unlike the delayed industrial mobilization of World War I, the U.S. rapidly mobilized its industrial might during the early years of World War II. Cornwall iron, copper, and cobalt were used in manufacturing a wide variety of goods, including arms, armament, and equipment used in the war. The federal government deemed production of these metals as vital to the nation's defense. So Cornwall mines were designated as a facility of strategic national significance. The security force for the mines and the concentrator plant was deputized as an auxiliary military police unit, or AMP, and operated under Army supervision until the end of the war. You can see on the right-hand side of the slide the banner that they used. The loss of troops, shortages of supplies, and requests to buy war bonds served as daily reminders to the workers and the residents of Cornwall of the high price of the war. Bethlehem Steel had already been ramping up production to meet the demands for iron and other metals in the years leading up to the war. For example, although production of cobalt, a trace metal present in Cornwall's ore, had begun in the late 1920s, the Cornwall division began operating a temporary plant to concentrate larger quantities of cobalt in the late 1930s. This plant was expanded in the early 1940s and supplied the nation's cobalt. From 1941 until 1951, and later from 1959 through 1971, Cornwall was the largest source of domestically produced cobalt in the United States. By the time of World War II, soldiers and sailors were assigned to diverse units that were no longer comprised of men from a single town or area. Lebanon County suffered 679 casualties during World War II, with 5 specifically from the Cornwall area, including Ray Conrad from Rexmont and George Gristick, George Clater, Edward Reppert, and Walter Vrenesick from Cornwall. Thanks to the thorough monthly reports to corporate headquarters in Bethlehem, we also have detailed records of how Cornwall contributed to the nation's defense during World War II. Besides ramping up production and coping with the constraints on the availability of supplies during the war, production of iron ore by the mines was hampered by manpower shortages. By December 1943, for example, about 25% of the 440 miners assigned to the number 4 mine at Cornwall had been drafted or had enlisted in military services. These were men like John Stickler, Lewis Miller, Julius Angelo, and Earl Heberling, who went on military leave from Cornwall to serve their nation. This meant that fewer miners were available to support operation in the mines around the clock, and production rates of iron ore decreased. On the last day of 1943, Eugene Grace, president of Bethlehem Steel, gave a radio address to Bethlehem Steel employees across the nation, including Cornwall, thanking them for their service and encouraging them to boost production to support the U.S. military. Labor shortages intensified in 1944, by when over 1 million Pennsylvanians had vacated jobs to join the military. Despite these shortages, Cornwall Division employees at the mines and concentrator plant maintained high levels of production. Pennsylvania workers produced more steel in 1944 than all of the Axis countries combined that year. Women entered the workforce at the concentrator plant to fill vacancies and to maintain production. When victory was achieved in 1945 and World War II ended, workers at the mines and concentrator plants celebrated for 3 days, August 14th, 15th, and 16th, 1945. Of the 159 men who were drafted or enlisted in military service from the number 4 mine at Cornwall, 6 men, or 4%, were killed in action. All gave some, but some gave all in service to their country. It is interesting to note that during the war, more men left work at Cornwall for other reasons than those who were drafted or enlisted. By November 1945, labor shortages began to subside as Cornwall veterans applied for reinstatement of their jobs. And by March 1946, Bethlehem Steel began laying off the women who worked at the concentrator plant as men returned to civilian service. Soon after the close of the Second World War, the U.S. military was summoned to support the United Nations peacekeeping mission on the Korean Peninsula. Just as it had during World War II, the mines and the people of Cornwall continued to support the nation by supplying iron and other metals. Although the labor supply was somewhat constrained during the Korean conflict, these constraints were nowhere near as significant as they had been during World War II. And as in prior wars, Lebanon County supplied men to the Army, Marines, Navy, and Air Force and suffered 14 casualties by the end of the war. The Korean War occurred during another period of significant transition for the mines and the concentrator plant. Mining in the open pit was shutting down, as you see in the slide on the right-hand side, just as mining in the number 3 and the number 4 mines began ramping up. At the concentrator plant, the new furnaces came online to produce iron concentrate pellets that were more efficient to feed into the blast furnaces than iron sinter. By the time the armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, this transition had been largely accomplished. Mining ended at Cornwall in 1973. After a brief hiatus, operation of the concentrator plant in Cornwall also ended soon thereafter in 1977. As you can see in this ore production graph for the Cornwall mines, production rates had begun to decline after World War II and continued decreasing during the Vietnam War as the ore deposit at Cornwall was depleted. Mining ended before the United States withdrew from Vietnam in 1975, and the war concluded. Lebanon County suffered 26 casualties during the Vietnam War, including Harold Basor from Cornwall and Edward Gernert from Quentin. Closure of the mines ended the era of significant contributions of Cornwall to our nation's defense. For over 236 years, Cornwall served the nation with honor. Of course, even though most of the contributions from Cornwall have stopped, the Veterans Administration Hospital in Lebanon has continued since the mid-1900s to provide quality medical care for our veterans. This Veterans Day and every day, let us remember our veterans with honor, respect, and gratitude. I want to thank you for participating in our webinar this evening. And I'd also like to thank the Friends of the Cornwall Iron Furnace for supporting this webinar, and especially Mike Emery, Cornwall Site Administrator, and Kathy Donaldson, Treasurer of the Associates. Now I'd be happy to answer your questions and listen to your comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. Another really great talk. Lots of great information in there, lots of things to unpack in that talk, particularly because of the time span that we're talking about. It's not just, many of the furnaces and many of the areas here in Pennsylvania, they were only operating in maybe a 20 or 30-year time period. And because Cornwall had such this long history, it touches everything from, 18th century, standing in line tactics up until, really what we consider modern warfare. So there's lots of things in there. So of course we do have some questions here. First one I'll start with, we have a couple from Bruce Chadbourne, but the first one I'll start with Dan Snyder. He has a question: how was cobalt used in the war?
So back in World War II time, cobalt was used as a hardener in certain steels, and it was also used especially in alloys that were made to support the aircraft industry. Because the aircraft engines had to run at high temperatures for long periods of time to support their sorties, it was important that the metal be able to withstand those kind of stresses, and cobalt was just the ticket to help make sure those alloys met their mission.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And here's one from Bruce, rather complex, so I'll read this out here. So there were tariffs on iron imports during the Civil War to protect U.S. iron production. These were lifted after the war, and the competition from foreign imports forced Cornwall furnaces to suspend production for a while in the early 1870s. Do you have any more information on this? And he then puts, Mrs. Colburn wrote young R.H. Coleman at school to be careful with his allowance. They were perceiving money to be tight. So this period in the early 1870s, do you have any thoughts on it? I have a few, but go ahead if you have any.
Well, I'll start and then I'll turn it back to you, Mike. So the question of tariffs on iron has gone all the way back to the 18th century. Even back when the colonies were around before the War of Independence, the question about imposing tariffs both in England and in the colonies on iron was a hot one. And what you see, looking at it from a historical perspective, setting aside the politics, is that those tariffs did have an impact on the price of iron and on the demand for iron, both domestically and abroad. And I think you can fast forward that all the way up to the late 20th century, well, even to this present time, when tariffs on iron and steel remain a significant concern, particularly for the domestic industry.
Yeah, I know that time period also, just like a lot of wars in the United States past, you have an economy that's based off of wartime consumption. So you have those prices of metal that are going up primarily because you have the government, purchasing at a very high rate. You have private industry trying to supply for the government that also has to buy at the same time, forcing prices upward. So you had that going on one hand in that 1860s time period, but also there was a lot of infrastructure that needed to be built at the exact same time in the East for the war, in the West for the war, and then people started looking westward as well. So there becomes this kind of rampant speculation in the need for railroads, which of course were major consumers of iron. And at a certain point, bank failures over that in Europe start a financial panic, which then lasts from like 1873 up until the mid to late 1870s. In Europe, it lasts even a little bit longer. So that could also be part of it, so that there's this kind of global economic downturn that in many ways starts because of over speculation in the iron industry, and of course the railroad industry, which really are, if not one and the same, they're hand in hand in this period, and one is really feeding the other. So that's, I think, part of what's going on in that time period. Another thing.
Hey, Mike. Just
yes.
while you're going on, I flipped back while you were speaking to this ore production chart from the Cornwall mines, because I think it illustrates what Bruce was talking about with the decrease in the 1870s for domestic iron production and tied up to the tariffs. That goes on and on throughout the rest of the years. Now, of course, it's somewhat swamped in this graph because of the tremendous increase in the production from the Cornwall mines, particularly during the lead up to World War II and in the years following. But if you blew up all the graph down there in the 1869, 1875 timeframe, you'd see that dramatic decrease in domestic production, at least from Cornwall.
Right, and also, unfortunately, that corresponded to when they had built Bird Coleman and also the North Cornwall Furnace. So there had been a tremendous outlay in capital to go ahead and bring these furnaces online almost exactly when this all begins and this economic downturn. So hard times even for the rich in the early 1870s. So the other piece that's on here that Bruce had asked, Walter Verancic, is that how you pronounced it?
Vernesic?
Vernesic, okay, thank you. Dying in World War II. He said that up until quite recently, there was a Betty and John Vernesic that were both Cornwall Manor residents. So that was a name that stayed around here. He kind of wondered whether they were related. So we'd have to look that up to see if there's, I'm sure there's an obit that would probably figure that out. There's another question here from Judith Clark. Was Robert Coleman the son-in-law of Peter Grubb?
No.
He was the son-in-law of another iron master, just not that one.
James Old.
Yeah, he was the son-in-law of James Old. And the families had business relations. I don't know if there are many family connections back and forth between the two. I'd almost be surprised if there weren't, but no, that was not the relationship there. So.
Of course, like I mentioned, Robert Coleman was at Elizabeth Furnace, and most of the ore that they used at Elizabeth Furnace came from Cornwall. So Robert Coleman knew of the value of the ore at Cornwall. And so it doesn't surprise me that as an enterprising young businessman, he lost no time in investing in and ultimately taking over the operation of the Cornwall mines, as well as the Cornwall Iron Furnace.
All right. So that looks like that is really the end of the questions, Mike. So I think I will close things up for the evening. So thank you all for joining us for this lecture. I especially want to thank Mike Weber for his presentation and for Kathy Donaldson for helping to organize this virtual talk. I'd also want to thank the Friends of the Cornwall Iron Furnace who sponsor this and the other programs that we have here at the Cornwall Iron Furnace. If you or your business would like to sponsor a future lecture, please contact the site for further information. And of course, donations are always gladly accepted to support this programming and other programming that we do at the Furnace. So please join us for our next lecture, which will not be until 2023, March 14th, 2023. This is our last lecture of the year. And in that lecture in March, it will again be Mike Weber, and he will be telling us all about slag. So that will be a talk that will be talking about the waste product slag from the iron furnaces. Also coming up, if you would be able to join us in person on December 3rd for our Christmas at Cornwall event. There will be tours of the furnace throughout the day, opportunity to have your photograph taken with Santa, who will be in the furnace office across the street. There will be children's activities, of course, everyone's favorite, homemade treats and other things as well. So that event will run from 9 o'clock to 4 o'clock. You can look for additional information on that as it becomes available on our Facebook page and website. So, and also just a reminder that the museum is now open Friday through Saturday. Please check our website for details and tour information. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Please stay safe, and until next time, good night.